They thought they could mistreat a horse without consequences. What they didn't know, that horse had an owner. And when he showed up, everything changed. Watch till the end and drop your city in the comments. The sun was hanging high, pouring down like fire on a lonely stretch of desert road. Heat waves rippled off the cracked asphalt, making the horizon dance like a mirage. The wind was dry, carrying dust and the scent of sagebrush across an untouched landscape where time felt frozen. The only sounds were the cry of a hawk overhead and the steady rhythm of hooves hitting the ground. One man rode through that emptiness, his shadow sharp against the golden haze. He sat calm and steady on a powerful chestnut stallion, like he'd been born in the saddle. His name? Chuck Norris. Beneath the brim of a sun-worn cowboy hat, his sharp eyes scanned the distance, memorizing the land without a word. The road ahead led to a small, half-forgotten town tucked against the hills. His horse, Grom, moved with ease, steady as always. They'd been through too much together to be bothered by a little silence and heat. Grom's coat shined in the sun, his muscles tense and ready, a survivor of long rides and hard fights. As they neared town, the first sign of life was a rusted old sign barely hanging on, "Welcome." But there wasn't much left to welcome anyone to. A fading gas station, a dusty general store, a few tired-looking shops, all whispering stories of better days long gone. At the center of it all was a roadside cafe, the kind of place where time crawls and the coffee never stops brewing. Chuck guided Grom to a wooden post outside, dismounted like he'd done it 1,000 times, and gave his horse enough slack to graze on the scraggly grass pushing through the pavement. Grom gave a quiet huff, shaking his mane like he appreciated the break. Chuck dusted himself off, adjusted his hat, and stepped inside. The cafe was dim, the air thick with the smell of coffee, grilled meat, and cigarettes from some earlier guest. A few locals were scattered around, an old trucker clutching a mug like it was keeping him alive, another man flipping through a beat-up newspaper. Behind the counter, a tired waitress looked up, gave a small nod, and went back to wiping things down. Chuck didn't need a menu. "Coffee," he said. That was all. She brought it moments later, steaming and black. He wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth sink into his fingers. First sip, strong, bitter, perfect. Outside, Grom stood still, unfazed by the new surroundings. He didn't scare easy, not with Chuck nearby. That horse knew who had his back. Chuck leaned back in his chair, watching the street through the window. There was peace in that moment, a rare kind. Just a man, a horse, the open road, and a good cup of coffee. He'd never stayed long in one place, but this quiet, this stillness, was something he never took for granted. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint. A low rumble. But it grew. Fast. Motorcycles. The deep, echoing growl of engines broke through the quiet like thunder rolling into town. It didn't belong here. It carried a kind of warning. Chuck didn't move. Didn't turn his head. But his grip on the cup tightened just a little. Because trouble had arrived. And it didn't know what it had just walked into. From his seat by the window, Chuck watched as a line of motorcycles appeared on the horizon, a pack moving in perfect sync, iron and leather glinting beneath the unforgiving sun. There were at least a dozen of them, engines roaring as they rolled into town like they owned it. Inside the cafe, everything shifted. The trucker froze mid-sip, his eyes sliding toward the window with quiet concern. The man with the newspaper stopped flipping pages. Even the waitress paused, her rag hanging limp in her hand. Everyone recognized the signs. A gang like that didn't roll through small towns for sightseeing. They came for control, for chaos. Chuck let out a slow breath and set his coffee down gently, like he was already making room for what was coming next. He didn't need to ask questions, he'd seen men like this before. They thrived on fear. On small towns that couldn't push back. They liked to make noise, liked to make sure no one missed their arrival. And if no one stood in their way, they did whatever they wanted. Outside, the gang rolled to a stop, their engines sputtering out like the growl of a wild animal satisfied with the kill. One by one, they dismounted, cracking knuckles, stretching limbs, scanning the town like it was already theirs. And then one of them spotted Grom. A tall, broad man, wearing a jacket plastered with skulls and flames, broke into a crooked grin. The others followed his gaze. Laughter started. A few nudged each other, already amused. It was the kind of laugh that had trouble stitched into every syllable. Then it happened. The leader of the pack took a step toward Grom, rolled his shoulders like he was about to put on a show, and without a word, drove his boot hard into the stallion's side. Grom flinched with a sharp snort, his muscles tightening, head jerking back, tether pulling taut. He didn't cry out. He didn't panic. But the pain was clear. The laughter that followed was loud and cruel. It poured into the cafe like poison. Inside, Chuck's hand slipped off the coffee cup. Slow. Intentional. Then, without a word, he stood. The scrape of his chair across the floor sounded louder than it should have in that silence. He adjusted his hat with the calm of a man who had no need to rush, because he already knew how this would end. The door creaked open, and Chuck stepped out. The heat outside was thick, the air tinged with dust and gasoline. The gang's laughter still hung in the air, cocky and careless, the sound of men who thought they were in control. Grom stood where Chuck had left him, chestnut coat twitching, ears flicking, dark eyes wary. He was holding steady. But the damage was done. The man who had kicked him was still there, his boot planted in the dirt, a wide grin cutting across his beard. He looked proud, like he'd just pulled off a joke at someone else's expense. He had no idea what was coming. Chuck stepped off the porch, boots landing in the dirt with quiet finality. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The leader noticed first. He looked Chuck up and down, tilted his head, and chuckled. Well, he said, arms opening like he was greeting an old friend. Looks like we found ourselves a real cowboy. The rest of the gang laughed. Some crossed their arms, others elbowed each other, watching like this was just the pre-show. From the doorway, the trucker took a slow step back. The waitress had stopped pretending to clean. Her eyes darted between Chuck and the gang, wide and unblinking. Chuck stopped a few feet from them. He scanned the group, no fear, no anger, just calculation. Calm. Quiet. Dangerous. The leader smirked, then turned back to Grom. He ran a hand along the stallion's neck, mockingly gentle. "This yours, cowboy?" he asked, almost sweet. Chuck didn't answer. The leader whistled low. "Hell of a thing," he said, glancing back at his crew. "Out here, acting like it's the Wild West." He leaned in closer to Grom, the grin never leaving his face. "Thing is, we don't much like people dragging old relics into the future. Thought we'd teach this one a little something." One of the bikers, younger than the rest, shifted uneasily. His fingers tapped against the handle of a belt knife. He wasn't laughing anymore. There was something in the way Chuck stood, something quiet, but heavy. Something that made you forget how tough you thought you were. And slowly, bit by bit, the gang was starting to feel it too. But the leader? He still hadn't noticed. The leader was having too much fun. He turned to his crew and jerked a thumb toward the row of parked bikes. "Maybe we should see if he can run as fast as those wheels over there," he sneered. A few chuckled. A few straightened, their boots shifting restlessly against the dirt. They were feeding off the moment, off the illusion of control. Chuck lifted his chin slightly, eyes locked on the man, his expression unreadable. The leader's smirk widened, then, without warning, he kicked Grom again, harder this time. The stallion cried out, rearing slightly as his front hooves left the ground and slammed back down in a cloud of dust. His breathing quickened, his muscles rippled beneath his coat, but the tether held firm, forcing him to stay. Inside the cafe, no one moved. No one breathed. Chuck didn't flinch. Didn't blink. His face remained still, carved from stone. But the air around him changed, like something ancient had just settled into place. Behind him, the trucker leaned further into the doorframe, his grip tightening around the cup in his hand. The waitress took a step back, her cloth dropping from her fingers without her realizing. One of the bikers laughed, but the sound trailed off when he caught the look on Chuck's face. The leader stepped away from Grom, brushing dust from his jacket like the whole thing had bored him. "I'd be real careful if I were you, cowboy," he said, still smirking. "Things can get ugly when a man forgets his place." Chuck tilted his head, just a fraction. But it was enough. The smirk on the leader's face faltered, if only for a split second. His eyes shifted, a flicker of something he couldn't name, something instinctual. He felt it now. That weight in the air. The pressure of something unseen but deeply felt. One of the bikers cleared his throat. Boss." A raised hand cut him off. The leader squared his shoulders, trying to shake the unease crawling up his spine. Chuck took a single step forward. The gang stiffened. Something about the way Chuck moved, slow, calm, deliberate, sent a pulse through the dirt under their feet. It wasn't force. It wasn't intimidation. It was presence. And then Chuck spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it landed like steel dropped in a still pond. "Step away from my horse." The words didn't rise. Didn't threaten. But they settled. Heavy. Immovable. The leader hesitated. His jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being told what to do, especially not by someone who looked like he'd walked straight out of a spaghetti western. His pride screamed to push back. But something else, older, deeper, told him to stop. Around him, more of the gang was shifting. Their earlier confidence thinning into something else. Not fear, not yet, but the question of it. Still trying to hold control, the leader exhaled through his nose. His smirk reappeared, weaker now, more forced. "And if I don't?" Chuck didn't blink. Didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed, cold, and calm. Then Grom stomped his hoof, a single, sharp strike against the dirt that cracked through the silence like a warning shot. The leader flinched. Chuck took one more step forward. The energy snapped like a pulled wire. One biker's hand hovered near the handle of something at his belt. Another turned slightly toward his bike. Their posture said they were still in it, but their eyes said something else. The leader's breath caught for half a second, just enough to show the crack. He'd expected rage. Maybe a yell. Maybe a threat. But this silence? This stillness? This was different. Chuck raised his hand, slow, steady, no sudden movements. And the smirk vanished. For the first time since they rolled in, the gang looked at each other. Really looked. The laughter was gone. The swagger had dried up. And the question that settled in their minds was simple and heavy. Did we just mess with the wrong man? The street fell into complete silence. A pause thick as oil stretched over everything. Then Chuck reached for Grom's tether, untying the knot in one fluid motion. The stallion shifted his weight, ears flicking back, then forward again as if sensing the tide had turned. Chuck ran a steady hand along Grom's neck, quieting the horse with a calm born from decades of trust. Then, without a word, he turned and walked straight toward the gang's leader. No sound followed, no boots behind him, no noise from the town, just the slow beat of his steps against dry earth. He moved like a man carrying gravity itself. The leader stood still, but his eyes betrayed him. His fingers curled, then relaxed, his stance shifting. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't posturing. This was something else entirely. His men were watching him. Waiting. None of them smiling now. Chuck kept walking, same pace, same purpose, until he stood just a few feet away. The leader scoffed under his breath, trying to summon what was left of his confidence. "You've got some nerve," he muttered. "Walking up to us like that. You sure you know what you're doing, cowboy?" Chuck said nothing. He just stood there, not blinking, not breathing heavy, not flinching. And that silence? It said everything. The leader swallowed, barely noticeable. He straightened, trying to hold on to his role, trying to believe this was still his town. But Chuck wasn't just another cowboy. He was the kind of man you don't see coming until it's too late. Behind Chuck, one of the younger bikers shifted nervously, his fingers tapping against the buckle of his belt. Another, who broader, arms inked with faded tattoos, rolled his shoulders like he was bracing for something he didn't understand. They all felt it now. That weight. That quiet pressure in the air. Like a storm was about to break, but no one could see the clouds. Chuck adjusted the brim of his hat. One smooth motion. Then he exhaled, slow, steady, controlled. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Level. But every word landed like a steel door closing. I told you to step away from my horse. The leader scoffed, but there was no confidence in it anymore. Just noise. And what if I don't? Chuck didn't blink. The silence that followed stretched like wire pulled too tight, until even breathing felt too loud. One of the gang let out a nervous chuckle, but it died mid-laugh, swallowed by the moment. Then the leader shifted, ever so slightly, eyes darting down for just a flicker of a second. Barely noticeable. But Chuck saw it. A crack. The leader let out a sharp breath, shaking his head like he was brushing off the tension. All right, he muttered, raising his hands in mock surrender. Didn't realize you were so attached to the damn thing. He took a step back, motioning for his men to do the same. No harm done, huh? Chuck didn't move. Didn't blink. Something in the leader's words rang false, and he could feel it. The whole town could feel it. Because this wasn't over. Inside the cafe, a chair scraped across the wooden floor, just a small sound. But it shattered the thin layer of fake calm. The leader's fingers twitched, just a little. And that's all it took. Chuck moved like lightning. Before the man could even draw a breath, Chuck's hand lashed out, catching the biker's wrist and twisting it with precise force. The leader stumbled, completely off balance, boots skidding in the dirt. He let out a grunt, and then Chuck struck, a single, controlled blow to the chest that sent the man flying backward into his own crew. Chaos exploded. One biker lunged, fist flying toward Chuck's face. Chuck ducked, calm as a whisper, grabbed the man's arm mid-swing, and flipped him with his own momentum, slamming him to the ground in a heap. Another came from the side. Chuck turned, ducked low, and drove his fist into the man's stomach, dropping him with a breathless wheeze. The leader, groggy and furious, charged again. But Chuck saw it coming, sidestepped effortlessly, hooked his boot around the man's ankle, and dropped him like a sack of bricks. The street froze again. Locals stood motionless, caught in the weight of the moment. The trucker in the doorway muttered something under his breath, eyes wide. The waitress clutched a towel against her chest, knuckles white. One of the remaining bikers looked down at the wreckage of his crew, and then back at Chuck. And this time, the look in his eyes wasn't confusion. It was fear. Real fear. The kind that only shows up when a man realizes. You picked the wrong fight. The leader groaned, pushing himself up on his elbows, a smear of dust across his face and blood at the corner of his mouth. What the hell are you? He spat. Chuck didn't answer. He adjusted his hat, not out of pride, not to intimidate, just habit. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't even sweating. The leader looked around and saw the truth, his men on the ground. A few backing away. One already walking toward his bike, head shaking, ready to be done. Chuck stepped forward. His boots hit the dirt with the same quiet rhythm they always had. The leader flinched. Not much. But enough. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand despite the pain shooting through his ribs. Pride kept him upright, but his eyes betrayed him. Because he knew. Everyone knew. The fight was already over. Chuck didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He turned just slightly, checking on Grom, the stallion still standing tall, ears forward, completely unshaken. The horse had known too. He always did. The gang leader's breathing was still uneven, hands clenched into fists that weren't going anywhere. But he didn't move forward again. Instead, he looked around, to his men, to the street, to the nothingness waiting beyond town limits. Then he lowered his gaze. "We're leaving," he muttered. It wasn't a statement. It was a surrender. Meant for himself more than anyone else. He turned, shoulders heavy now, and gestured for the others to follow. They moved, slower, quieter, a few limping, most avoiding eye contact. No more words. No more threats. Just the soft rumble of engines kicking back to life, this time without confidence. Chuck watched. Unmoving. Expression unreadable. The leader paused once, one last glance over his shoulder. But he didn't say anything. Then, with a final growl of retreating engines, the gang rode off. And the silence they left behind felt like something sacred. The gang roared off, tires kicking up dust. For a long moment, the town stood frozen. Then someone exhaled. The trucker let out a low whistle. The waitress whispered, "Well, I'll be damned." Chuck returned to the cafe, sat back by the window, and sipped his coffee. Outside, ground stood tall and calm. The town was quiet once more. But the dust had barely settled when the gang leader stopped at the edge of town. Still breathing hard, hands gripping the handlebars, he was torn between reason and pride. Humiliated in front of his crew, something inside him refused to let it go. He glanced at his men, bruised, frustrated, hesitant. He looked back at the cafe and saw Chuck, still seated, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. That calm, it made his skin crawl. He shut off the engine. Without a word, he stood up and walked back toward the cafe. The gang followed, slower now. Chuck didn't need to look up. He felt it, the shift in the air, the boots on the porch, the weight of unfinished business. Inside, the tension returned like a cold wind. The door creaked open. The gang entered, silently forming a wall between Chuck and the exit. The leader stepped in, his presence dark and heavy. "You're real quiet, cowboy," he said, trying to sound in control. "I don't like that." Chuck didn't respond. "I don't like guys who make me look bad," the leader added, stepping closer. Then, in a final move of bravado, he grabbed Chuck's coffee cup and smashed it on the floor. The cafe fell silent again. Chuck tilted his head, narrowed his eyes, and then moved. He stood in a flash and drove his fist into the leader's gut, sending him reeling. Chaos erupted. One biker lunged, Chuck countered and dropped him. Another swung wide, Chuck ducked and landed a jaw-cracking hit. A third reached for Chuck, only to be thrown into a table. The leader tried again, rage in his eyes, reaching for something at his waist, but Chuck was faster. A kick to the knee. A blow to the chest. He collapsed. Hard. The rest of the gang froze. One reached for a knife but didn't dare draw it. The leader groaned on the floor, struggling to breathe. Chuck stood over him, calm and still. The leader made one last desperate move, lunged with a hidden blade. But Chuck caught his wrist mid-strike, twisted until the knife hit the floor, and with a final move, dropped him again. This time for good. Chuck placed his boot over the man's hand. "That's how it feels to be helpless," he said, voice steady. No one moved. No one spoke. The gang had lost, not just the fight, but the illusion of power. One by one, they backed off. Limping. Shaken. Silent. Engine started again, but with none of the roar from before. And just like that, they were gone. The cafe exhaled. The waitress finally released the towel she'd been clutching. The trucker shook his head, muttering, "Never seen anything like that." Chuck stepped inside, surveyed the damage, broken chairs, spilled coffee, silence. The waitress refused his money. "You did more than enough," she said. Chuck turned to leave. "You got a name, cowboy?" she asked. He paused. "Yeah," he said with a faint smile. "But I don't think you need it." He mounted Grom, tipped his hat, and rode out. No one stopped him. No one forgot him. As he disappeared into the horizon, the town returned to life, but something had changed. The kind of change that sticks. Trouble had come. But it didn't stay. Because trouble doesn't linger. When it runs into a man like Chuck Norris,